Hi, my name is Saikat Datta. I am essentially a journalist and also a policy director with the Center for Internet and Society. And you've heard a few debates going on in the last 2 days about privacy, security, and obviously everybody comes back to Aadhaar and suddenly the lines get very sharp. And you have people from the technical community saying this is going to help India, technology is very big. And then there are others who say, no, it's not going to help India, it's going to create many more problems. And if you look at a lot of criticism, a lot of discussions that's going around in political fields today, the first reaction is, are you being national or are you being anti-national? So therefore, I decided to examine the debates around security, privacy, and technology by asking the question, is India's technology or tech community anti-national? So while I was preparing for it, unfortunately, I saw this. And this really scared me, that speakers usually are people who don't think so much. So before you judge me, that's a disclaimer that I'm putting up in front. I usually try to think and I don't try to speak so much, but this was a very scary thing to see. So I'll try and tell you a few stories and try to bring everything into this whole debate about Aadhaar, but I'll try to take it from certain fields that I'm a little more familiar with. How many of you remember this movie which everybody's talking about? Tom Hanks, Meryl Streep. This is a movie called The Post. I mean, so The Post is, I don't know, has anybody seen this film? Okay, we have one person. I think more people use 2FA than watch films. So that's a good thing, but that's also not a very good thing. You should see more films. But this is a film called The Post. It's a very interesting movie. And if you see this man, this is an actor called Tom Hanks and this is Meryl Streep. He is the editor of a newspaper called the Washington Post in America. And she, at that time in the 1970s, was the owner, right? And this is how they actually look. The same man played by Tom Hanks and Katharine Graham, Meryl Streep, this is the owner. What is the story about? The story is about somebody who comes in possession of top secret documents when America was at war. So if I were to ask you this question, that if you were to have top secret documents when India is at war, will you release them or leak them to the media? By a show of hands, how many would you say, yes, we should leak? Top secret documents relating to the war. I'm asking you about India. If you had those documents, will you release it to anybody? How many of you say, no, we will not release? Okay.
We should tell army that these documents are released.
That's a good point. But the army already has them. It's
no,
a.
But they should know that somebody also might have it and they need to change the plan.
Okay. So releasing these documents, was it a national act or an anti-national act? If somebody were to release documents while your country is at war. Okay, that's a good answer, that if it compromises national security, then yes, it is a anti-national act. Any other? Do you think it's an anti-national act to release top secret documents while your country is at war and your soldiers are dying on the battlefield? You're at war. The country is at war. So do you think it is anti-national to release these documents? How many by a show of hands say yes? I guess a lot of you will say yes. So this is the story of how top secret documents were leaked by a researcher who had access to them while their country was at war. And what did the government do? The government immediately went to court and said that we have to ban the publication of these things because they have compromised national security. And so the case from the lowest court in the next 15 days traveled right up to the Supreme Court of the United States. And in 1971, this was this major case where two of America's biggest newspapers were in Supreme Court demanding the right to publish these documents even though the country was at war. And what did the Supreme Court did? And a full bench of the Supreme Court sat and heard the case. And what do you think was the decision of the Supreme Court? Don't publish. I have to. Any other? Don't publish, etc. Well, by a majority of 6 judges to 3, the Supreme Court said it is the constitutional right of the newspapers to publish these documents and no action can be taken against them. So is the Supreme Court now national or anti-national?
They're not being rational.
So they are not being rational. Anybody else who feels the Supreme Court became anti-national in America?
They're going for the Constitution, so I don't think it's anti-national.
So that's a great answer. The United States Supreme Court is going by the Constitution. So hold that thought and we'll come back to it. Now, when a huge bench of the court passes a judgment, some judges write individual opinions on why they decided to allow this decision. So this is one of the most famous opinions by Justice Hugo Black, and this is what he says. The press was protected so that it could bear the secrets of the government and inform the people. Only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government, and paramount among the responsibilities of a free press is the duty to prevent any part of the government from deceiving the people. And this is the most important line in the judgment: sending them off to distant lands to die of foreign fevers and foreign shot and shell. So what Justice Hugo Black said is that if your soldiers are being sent to wars which are based on lies, it is the duty of every citizen to stand up and question the government, question that decision, and ensure that your soldiers don't get killed. So was the Supreme Court being national or anti-national? In this case, national, etc. And as he said, the Constitution helps you decide whether you are being national or anti-national. So that's a great answer that came from him. Your national, what is anti-national is not decided by what people say on Twitter or on Facebook. It is actually decided by a document called the Constitution, and the first amendment to the United States Constitution said that the freedom of the press cannot be questioned. Now, why did they have such a first amendment? Any guesses why? Why did the United States 300 years ago make this the first amendment? Exactly. So, how do you and me as citizens, take a decision whether the government is doing the right thing or the wrong thing? Only through information. We need to know what is the government taking. Are these decisions based on fact? What are those facts? And how do we know that? Now, if you ask the government PR agency to tell you, they will only say the good things, or they'll tell you the colored things. So the founding fathers of the United States, the Constitution, who wrote the Constitution, they decided we need to have a medium which is completely free, which cannot be put under pressure to say different kinds of stories, but will have complete freedom to tell exactly what they find, and therefore we have to make it a constitutional right. And as a result, freedom of the press in America became a constitutional right. And based on that constitution, the judges of the Supreme Court passed this decision, and almost 45 years later, even today, even if an American journalist publishes something absolutely top secret, it will not be prosecuted under any law. So the next question is, why do we need technology? Yes.
Just one question. Like you said, press cannot be penalized for anything like this. But we have been seeing the whistleblowers that have come recently.
So if you give me another 15 minutes, you will find some of the answers. And after that, let's have that discussion. So why do we need technology? Sounds like an obvious question, but I want to hear what do you have to say. Why do we need technology?
It's in the government, I think it encourages transparency.
As a country, why do we need technology? Advance faster, to improve the life of citizens, to reach more people. So you are hearing why we need technology to improve lives of citizens, to advance faster, maybe to have a better economy, better security. This is what technology is supposed to do. So 2 years ago, I published a research paper of mine, which is basically the historic antecedents of India's cybersecurity. That what the cybersecurity policies that we see in India today, what are the driving factors behind it? And the story that really leaps out from the research that I did is the importance of technology for India and its founding fathers in 1947. So if you look at history, we were a country which was completely destroyed by colonialism. The British came, ruled for 200 plus years and completely destroyed us. So when our founding fathers found freedom, their first thing was that technology is the answer to try and bridge the gap with the rest of the developed world. So technology from that perspective became a major driving force of everything started. So you have these huge engineering projects, big dams being coming up, and everything was looked at as major engineering solutions. And every time the globe tried to push India down, at different parts you will find people trying to use technology to fight that difference. But you also find some anomalies. Like in the 1950s under Dr. Homi Bhabha, there was a committee set up which said we need great amounts of computerization in this country. And at that time, computerization was a very, very new thing. But that man and his committee had the vision to see that we need this. And they said we will need large computers on a regional basis. So they didn't think in terms of PCs or computers coming in everywhere, but east, west, north, south must have some kind of computerization so that India can advance. 10 years later, just 10 years later, another committee was set up which said computerization is dangerous for India because it will end up killing labor, people will become jobless. So they took a policy decision not to go in for computerization. And then if you see in the political further in the 70s, mid 70s and all, there was this huge decision to throw out all the international computing companies or companies which are dealing with any kind of technology as a sort of a as a pushback against any kind of indigenization, any kind of international MNC driven technology projects, so that this was the new nationalism that was coming up. So in the name of nationalism, we pushed out technology. Now, if you, I mean, this is available online, so you can look at how the story unfolds, etc. So the next question is, so if you are looking at technology, how many of us from the technology sector or space really know why do we build and do we know what we are building? So if I am writing a particular piece of code and I am going to try and achieve something, what are the factors that go into mind when you are writing that piece of code? Think intuitively. If you are writing a piece of code, why do you write it? Great. That's the first thing, that somebody has a problem, so I am trying to write this code, and will it plug this code? Any other?
In a better way, faster.
To improve a certain kind of processes, etc., we are writing a certain kind of code, which is something similar to what he also said. Any other reason why we are writing code? So basically, nobody will disagree that it is to make things better. Will anybody write code to hurt people? Exactly. So even though every time we say that we are going to do things, the first thought that comes to mind, but the fact of the matter is malwares are still written, viruses are still written, you will make some kind of malicious code because you have a certain kind of a objective, etc. So so as we start looking at that question, let us start bringing in certain different kinds of elements. So one is historic, that every time I am writing a piece of code, I look at what was written earlier, what are the possibilities, etc. from a certain. But we also look at it in a socio-political context, that first this was not available, now this is available, therefore we are going to be writing this, and so on and so forth. So you expand that a little more into looking at what are the socio-cultural historic reasons why we are writing this piece of code. then we start trying to rationalize it in terms of money, that this is the amount of money this will take, this is the amount of resources that we will need to build this technology, and then we say these are the end benefits of why we will end up writing this piece of code, because this is what it can achieve. So we will all get into, and that's how technology, if you look at the history of India's technology prowess, this is how it started. Like, one of my favorite examples is what happened with the cryogenic engine. In the 80s, India wanted to build a cryogenic engine to go into space, and it can also have implications for our missile program. But the Americans first said you give all the contracts to an American company. So India started negotiating with them, but for some reason the negotiations didn't come through, and India started talking to the Russians. Immediately, they passed sanctions against India to deny certain kinds of technologies to India. So you see, so Americans, as long as we were negotiating with them, they were completely fine with it. Moment we went to another vendor, they immediately blocked and declared sanctions. And then it started for Indian scientists at ISRO, etc., to start trying to build these engines on their own. And that set back the space program by decades, but it also forced our scientists to try and build that technology indigenously. So you have these kind of stories. But this is how we try to rationalize the projects that we build. And this brings me to something like this. This came out day before yesterday. And the debates that we are currently facing about Aadhaar and privacy and etc. So just before I came here, one gentleman, he's a Inspector General from Maharashtra, and he said, but Aadhaar, why do you think Aadhaar can do surveillance? It can't do surveillance, it is not surveillance technology. And you will find a lot of these arguments being put out today. So when I started looking at this, and I started looking back and started talking to a lot of people who were involved in building the Aadhaar stack and whatever, etc., I asked each one of them that A, my earlier questions, did you know what you were building? And many of them came up with answers that I'm hearing today. How did you rationalize what were you building? Again, a lot of people came up with the same kind of answers, etc. So let's do a quick show of hands and let's see what is the sense of the room here. How many of you believe that Aadhaar can plug all the leakages of money that is taking place? By a show of hands. One person. Sorry? Sorry? Streamline? So you're saying it cannot plug. So you're saying it can try and it can plug, but not entirely sure whether it can do 100%. So suddenly there are certain doubts. So do we know what we are building? So do we know what we are building? But if you speak to people who worked on the, sorry? You had a question?
It can't do anything really by itself. It's an identity store. It's whatever processes you have that put into it. And that's the problem, is where people generalize an identity system, even with access management and with the actual rights that are identified, that people get because of their identity.
So, sorry? Okay, so what he said was that it's basically an identity project and it...
You put on the spot.
No, I'm not, I'm just trying to...
It's an identity store,
It's an identity store.
and it doesn't really do anything by itself,
By itself, it doesn't do anything
except for identifying people.
except for identifying, and may I also add the word authenticating people?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So that's the rationale that he is giving us. But if you study the documents when it was first created, it was basically done as a project which will A, give an identity, therefore an authentication, and therefore lead to the delivery of subsidies to the right people and ensure that there are no leakages. That was the initial rationale in 2009. And if you see some of the great architects of this Aadhaar project, they have also written a book on it called Reimagining India or Imagining India, something like that, where they have mentioned all this. I mean, no names, but you can find the book and read this yourself. So these documents exist. Somewhere down the line, when questions are being raised, they start rationalizing it by saying this can also do this and this can also do that. And today when there is so much of furor around it, somebody says, but Aadhaar doesn't collect anything. It doesn't do anything. So then if we start looking back at what technology is doing and what was being built, and if you go back to those two questions I've raised, here's my question. If it is not collecting anything and it is only identifying and authenticating you, why do you need to link it to any other database? Somebody will say, but if we don't link it, then how do we authenticate, how do we identify, etc.? Fair question. So my next question is, if it's such a great thing, why do you have to make it mandatory? So somebody will say, look, if we don't make it mandatory, we are Indians, nobody follows anything, so if you don't push it down the throat, they will not do anything, so we have to do it. Fair point? I mean, some will say, some anti-nationals will say it's not a fair point, but let's say, I think it's mandatory. I've taken that decision. So now let's go on to the next thing. Now who will decide whether it's mandatory or not? Will it be you and me?
When you are saying mandatory, from what perspective you are linking to something is mandatory?
By mandatory, I mean saying that you have to do it. That is the word.
Linking or
You have to have that Aadhaar because you have to do, if you want to get certain things, you will have to do it.
fair enough, right? That is what is the
So there is a mandatory element to it. So now if say, who will decide whether it can be mandatory or not? Who do we go to? In a democracy like India, who do we go to? Sorry? Rule makers. He said rule makers, but can you? Sorry?
again, we are coming back to the parliament, right?
Okay, parliament. Great point. That will come back to parliament. Anybody else? Judicial. Anybody else? Jim Morrison? No. Okay.
Constitution is what,
Doesn't have a constitutional role.
those are the people
Sorry?
who are representing, right? Because in a country like India, right? And that is how the every law gets through.
Okay. So how many of you have read the Aadhaar Act? Only one person, but she's a known suspect, so she's an anti-national, so we'll discount her. So none of you have read the Aadhaar Act. Even you haven't read. I'm surprised. You surprised me. But the point is, if you read the Aadhaar Act, there is a certain line which says that however in issues of national security, this data can be collected and shared with anybody. I mean with the concerned authorities. Now if the act is saying something like this, will somebody still argue that what does Aadhaar collect? Your act is saying that, and all of you said that parliament and judiciary are the decision makers. Now parliament, what has parliament said? If you go back to the last Lok Sabha, a standing committee of parliament got together and they said this is the most dangerous thing that you can create. None of the promises have any substance in it. We have examined it thoroughly and we find that this is a great danger to India's democracy. Parliament said that. And who was the chairperson of that standing committee? Jaitley, I heard. Well, he wasn't. It was a BJP MP, his name was Yashwant Sinha, and it had a lot of members from the BJP, they said that this is dangerous. So that's one side of the story. What did the courts do when it was challenged? You also agree that's part of your constitutional scheme of things? What did the court say, Supreme Court say? So the Supreme Court in two orders in 2015 and 2016 said it is dangerous, has limited capability, and it cannot under any circumstances be made mandatory. Two orders passed specifically to the government to limit this, because even the courts and the judiciary started seeing some kind of danger to what was being built. So parliament has said something, your judiciary has said something, but what are we doing with it? And here is the question, that every time now I go back to those people who built Aadhaar and who wrote about it and whatever they have done, my question to is same. Did you know what you were building? Answer is no, but we wanted to do welfare, we wanted to do good thing. How did you rationalize it? We wanted to save subsidies, which is why we wanted to do it. So certain kind of rationalization, etc. And today, when all these details are still out, you still have somebody, the writer is a founding something of Aadhaar, etc., writes this whole in India's biggest newspaper that it is not collecting anything, it is absolutely safe. And nowhere in this article will you find a reference to that section in the Aadhaar Act which says your data can be taken under national security purposes. Why? Second question, how many of you have Aadhaar? So my final question, in that when you are signing up for Aadhaar, there is a question. Can your details be shared with any other entity? So all of you are from the tech community. How many choices did you find when that question was asked? Was it a multilateral question? Yes, no, maybe, etc. Sorry?
Checkbox only, right?
Single
Single checkbox.
checkbox, what did it say?
Yes.
Does that sound like a option? Does it make it mandatory? Kind of now, yeah, because yes, we said my data. Did it specify with whom it can be shared? So today, if your data wants to go to X company sitting in China, but routed through an American, etc. face, maybe that could go to them. We don't know. So the question is that you've built something, you are not saying, no, it does not do any of that, but the act says in writing. When you are signing up for it, it says it is in writing, etc. So now, all those people who built this, in violation of what Parliament said, in violation of Supreme Court said, my question is, are they being national or anti-national? Tough question, right? Really tough question. So the question that I am now posing to you is that every time you start building a piece of technology, how many of us sit for a minute to think of the consequences that can happen because of what you're building? How many of you have been put under surveillance in life by a government? Active, actual surveillance. Nobody? So I have, as I call it, user experience of being put under surveillance by India's intelligence agencies, especially the Intelligence Bureau, where I actually caught 3 people putting me under surveillance, and then we handed them over to the police. I snatched away their phone, took out their SIM card, put it into my phone, saw all the phone records, and then figured out where they are from and who they were speaking to. So this, you know what happens when you're put under surveillance? How many of you think that if you're not doing anything wrong, what's the harm if somebody watches over you? How many of you feel that? This is a strange crowd. Oh, there is one. Thank you. So, do you have a phone? Can you share it with us? But you haven't done anything wrong.
No, why?
No, but why? But you have not done anything wrong.
It's my private.
But why is it a private, but you have not done anything wrong?
I have my choice to share, right?
Ah, choice. His defense is choice, and he's also used the word private.
Privacy.
Privacy. But that's illegal under the act. But that is illegal under the act. If you give it to me, it is illegal.
So my question here is, suppose you want to travel to US, you need a passport that is mandatory, and Indian government can share your detail with your government. So have you ever raised any concern over that? So I want to go to US, but I don't want to take my passport with me.
So we'll come to that question. But the point is, you've raised this issue of privacy, and I think many people here, I think the majority in this room, were a little skeptical that even if I have not done anything wrong, why do you want my details? Right? Why does the government want any details? Now the quick thing is, moment you are put under surveillance, what does it do to you? What do you think happens to you? Not you, not you, not you.
Check everything about you and what bank account.
But what does it essentially change about you? Think intuitively. Conscious, paranoid, but why? Why does it make you conscious and paranoid? If I'm constantly watching you, why would you be worried? Sorry? if I'm constantly watching you, no thief will come, but I'll be watching everything you are doing. Would that make you comfortable or uncomfortable? Why?
I can't think freely.
You can't think
It's my
freely.
right, freedom.
So all these great answers, but let me break it down to an even simpler thing. That moment somebody is keeping an eye on you, without realizing it, you've already become a suspect. And when you start doing this on a mass scale, you are creating a country full of suspects who are always wondering, have I made a mistake? And that is what surveillance does to you. So if you have not done anything wrong, even then, your mindset will always be that I'll get caught, so am I doing the right thing? You will constantly start questioning yourself. How many of you come from a corporate background, working in private companies? How many of you have managers? Right? Now, if you have a manager who wants to know from 9 o'clock when you stepped in till 6 o'clock in the evening, a minute by minute report on what you did and how you spent the day from 9 to 6 in the office, how many of you will be comfortable with that? Nobody? But you have not done anything wrong. If you are good, honest employees, why would you have a problem with that? Sorry? I wouldn't, but I just want to know what people say.
That is the expectation.
We'll give it.
Do that,
We can do
right?
that.
But that is not the way of working.
Exactly. That's a great point. He says it is not the way of working. Why isn't it the great way of working?
If it is not done with everyone, if suppose everyone is
No, we want to do it with everyone because I want productivity from all
I'm
men.
not getting singled out. So that's
Huh.
not done.
So you are okay if it is done to everybody.
Yeah, because if it's happening,
Huh.
I'm not getting singled out.
But if you look at studies on corporate culture and management, everybody will agree that if I put too much focus and do not give you enough autonomy, productivity goes down, right? If I'm constantly under pressure, I'll be thinking about that I'm under pressure. I will not have the mind space to write a good piece of code. I'll be worried about aaj main report dunga ki nahi. I spent 7.5 minutes going to the toilet in these 9 hours. That will have to be put because I have to account, otherwise how do I leave out that 7.5 minutes? But that is a fact. I had to spend 23 minutes eating a sandwich, fact. 17 minutes having 3 cups of coffee. And in the rest of the time, so in a 9-hour time, I actually spent just about an hour eating a sandwich, 2 cups of coffee and time in the toilet. That's it. I didn't do anything and I still worked for 8 hours. But how productive will you be?
There's something I want to share. I work in Government JC, where we are. Hello? Yeah. So where we are supposed to mark our attendance through our Aadhaar number. So in the morning, we have to punch with our thumb impression, we have to enter our Aadhaar ID. And it is actually mandatory for all the government offices in Delhi. My office is in South Block, so I'm part of it. So there is a report which is calculated after the end of the month, how many working hours each scientist or an officer has done.
But that is still a sum of hours spent inside a particular building,
Yeah,
but not
but-
how many minutes you spent, say, having a cup of coffee
No,
or
definitely
etc.
that's not there. But then
That-
again, there is a point.
Understood.
I mean, you're supposed to be in the office for
This much time to this much.
8:30 hours. I mean, in case if you're not there, you're not there for half an hour, then you'll be issue a notice or something, which I somehow feel, being in a research organization, it's not really required.
But we also agree that it does bring down productivity. So far, no dispute there if I'm constantly. Now imagine if you are a country and you have a government which has the kind of power to constantly monitor everything you're doing all the time, will you still be a productive country? And this idea is not my original idea. If you just Google a man called Alan Westin, Alan Westin, one of the biggest scholars of privacy and what it does to a society, etc., he has given 4 major reasons or 4 postulates based on which the lack of privacy can do to a country, a nation, and to society, and you will realize the dangers this can happen. Now imagine if I were to give this kind of power to a particular government. Today you have a decent, good government, but they say power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. If I have that power on you, what's to stop me? The second thing about surveillance, what can surveillance do other than making you feel a suspect? Quick, think intuitively. What can surveillance do to you? Great. And what kind of a misuse can I do? Sorry? Yeah, but to what is the end result? Suppress. But let me give you a crazy thing. If I have some information of what you are doing, can I manipulate you and I never let you know that I actually have the information? Can I manipulate you? Absolutely. So I can manipulate you, which is what we do social engineering, as he brilliantly pointed out. And with that kind of information, I can manipulate you at an individual level, at a mass level. So now the question is, if somebody says, but it does not collect anything, it does not do any surveillance, what are you talking about? My question goes back, is that do we look at the consequences of what we build as technologists, and do we think about the larger questions that can get impacted whenever we are building something? And therefore, we come to this whole thing about that while there is a technological aspect to whatever we are building, there is also the issue of the social impact, the historical impact, the political impact. And those questions we cannot do away with. And I'll end it because I'm also running out of time, is some scientists who built a beautiful thing called the atom bomb, and after it blew up, there was the Secretary of War who said this was a deliberate, premeditated destruction, was our least abhorrent choice. So he tried to justify it, and every government will try to justify all the wrong things by saying this was the least worst choice. But what did the scientists feel? As the news started coming back, earlier everybody, all the technologists of their time, the greatest physicists, the greatest scientists of their time were very exuberant, but slowly started getting introspective, and by stages they started becoming morose, and some found themselves reflecting guiltily on what they had done. This is a fact of history. So the final point that I want to tell you is, no government, no technology will come to you and say, look, I want to build the best surveillance system in the world. They'll come and tell you, we want to build the best welfare mechanism in the world. They'll come and tell you, I want to build the best system where we will plug all leakages and make you the smartest people on the planet. Nobody will come and tell you, I am building a technology which will always put you 24/7 under a lens, which will ensure that I have the power over you in perpetuity. Nobody sells anything like that. Sadly, if you go through the documents, the chairman of the Unique Aadhaar Authority has said at some point in an official PowerPoint presentation that this can actually have a 360-degree profile of all of you. He has said this. If you Google, you will still find that hosted on a government website. The chairman of the authority has admitted that in as many words. So the point again goes back to that when we are building technology, are we thinking of the ethical implications, the larger questions? And therefore, and as we all said, a nation is decided by the constitution, by its judiciary, by its parliament. The question that I pose to you is India's tech sector national or anti-national? Thank you. If you had any questions.
Regarding the whistleblower,
Hi, I'm Shreyas Hosoor. I just have a question. Rather, this entire discussion brings me to a larger question. So, is it Aadhaar which is wrong, or is it the Aadhaar Act which is wrong? Can we make the act to go in line with what we want Aadhaar to be? First question. Second question is that, yes, surveillance is a big question mark, and surveillance is a question mark in a country or state that we live in today. If you probably travel to one of these countries like Iceland, you'll find that there are, of 3 lakh people, there are 600 policemen. You don't find anybody on the streets. The airports, you'll not find security at the airports at all, whereas you find security here every step in the airport. And just drawing parallels to that, unfortunately, we live in a situation where that kind of security is required. And just to look at that watershed date, 9/11, what US was pre 9/11 and what US is post 9/11. Again, there's a big question of liberty versus surveillance. So what do you have to say on this?
So 2 questions. Shall I answer questions, or do you want to collect a few more questions? So first question is that is there something wrong with the act, or is there something wrong? So this is a very fundamental question and is the heart of what I have been trying to argue. What is fundamentally wrong is the technology, because the technology has now been weaponized and any amount of act will not be able to fix it. Because once you have created something which gives enormous power to a select few people, they will never let it go. And which is why today you are seeing it being linked to different kinds of data sets, because everybody is figured out in a certain position of power that it's not going to really something they don't want to do away with, because it gives them that kind of power. That's the first point. Second point is, which will also try and answer the second question. First of all, look at the promises that it made, that it will plug this, plug that, etc. But you see, what is the, if I were to describe the Constitution of India or any constitution in one line, what would that line be? Basically, the Constitution is a document not to limit you and me as citizens, but to limit the powers of the people who we have given for a limited period of time the power to rule and govern over us. That is the basic ethos and the heart of the Constitution. Now, when you have that in your constitutional scheme of things, people in power, if you go on giving more power to them, you are actually going against the heart and spirit and letter of the Constitution. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is, like he has mentioned in the question, we live in this security scenario, we live in a corrupt nation, so on and so forth. Fact of the matter is, many of these things takes place because those in power are not accountable to us. You had an act of Parliament in 2004 called the Right to Information Act, which was to make government more transparent to citizens of India. As a result, it would ensure greater accountability of those people in power. Today that act is almost dead, and yet we say that we will continue to protect those of us who are in power and continue to take away the rights of those people who are not in power, people like you and me. So that security, so the question is, the moment you have this security argument, what exactly are you protecting? Are you protecting a status quo? Are you protecting a certain way of life? Or are you trying to protect an ideal which has been enshrined in the Constitution of India? Unfortunately, in this country, we have a lot of these issues because we have completely turned the Constitution around and created all these problems. What the Constitution said we should get, we did not do any of that, and today we are in this situation which will get progressively worse because we constantly violate basic rights of citizens every day. So I am out of time.